When I interview designers for a role on my team at Batove, I always ask them the question, what makes a good design good? And while all the answers are different and a few of them are kind of right, they all sound something like this. Simplicity, or perhaps a good use of space. My personal favorite, though, is this one here, when you can't remove anything else. Now, these are good things, but they don't necessarily describe what makes a design good. Certainly not in the eyes of a business, probably not for UX either. So we're here today because designers are really bad at talking about design and explaining it to non-designers in a way that makes sense, and yet we live in a world where the most articulate person usually wins. Now, what's the right answer to that question? Well, I would say that a design is good when it solves a problem, right? Whatever that problem is, it could be usability, conversion, engagement, whatever the problem is, a good design solves it. And the difference between a good designer and a great designer is their ability to not only solve that problem, but then to explain it to someone else in a way that makes sense. So actually, I would say there are three things, really, that your designs need in order to be successful for both your work and for you, yourself, and your career. The first one I've already mentioned is that it solves a problem. The second one is that it's got to be easy for users as well. If we're really practicing a user-centered design approach, then we naturally have to take into account the needs and expectations of our users. And I think we do pretty good at these two. We kind of understand that this is our job. But the third thing that you also need, which I think is overlooked, maybe even just a little bit misunderstood, is that it also has to be supported by everyone. Because you could solve the problem. You could make it easy, but if you don't have the support of everyone on your team, all of the decision makers, then it's all for naught. It's meaningless. You might as well go back to the drawing board or have stayed at home that day. That design and those users that we care so much about will never have the opportunity to even see or experience our work if we don't have the support that we need. Well, what happens when you don't have the support that you need? Well, you end up rehashing the same conversations over and over again with the same people, right? Why did we do this again, right? People will keep adding things on top of the interface, right? Just slapping stuff on, all because you weren't able to fend it off. And in a worst case scenario, you may even end up shipping a compromised user experience. Why? All because you couldn't help someone understand why you did what you did so that you could get their support, so you could move on to the next thing. So in that sense, I believe that being a great designer is just as much about your communication skills as it is about your design chops. You could have the most innovative design in the world, but if no one understands where you're going, if no one understands your intention behind your work, then you're not going to build the momentum to create the success that you need to get approval for your work and move on to the next thing. Well, you might be asking yourself, well, I mean, why does this even matter, right? If we're the experts on design, we were hired for our expertise, why should we have to justify ourselves to non-designers? Well, the reality is that UX has gone mainstream, hasn't it? In pop culture even, in today's modern organizations, whole companies now are pivoting to make design their center focus, right? We now have design leaders and CXOs, CEOs who previously had no interest in design are now intimately involved in our processes, and we have to be able to explain ourselves to them. Everyone knows what they think it should look like. Everyone is a designer now, right? Even people in accounting are not going to be able to hold themselves back from telling you how they think it should look, and we have to be able to deal with this phenomenon. So because of this, I see things like this all the time. The CEO button is an unusual or otherwise unexpected request from an executive to add a feature that completely destroys the balance of a project and undermines the very purpose of a designer's existence. Right? This sort of thing happens all the time. It's funny because it's true, right? We can spend weeks or months pouring in all the best practices that we learned at this conference, and one executive can come in and blow up the whole thing, right? And we have to learn how to deal with this. I also see this a lot, the homepage syndrome, a condition whereby the home screen of an application or website becomes a catch-all for everything, creating a garage sale of links, buttons, and banner ads that unravels the fabric of usability causing designers to cry themselves to sleep. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, the homepage just becomes this huge mess. And we've got to learn to deal with this phenomenon. And so for our time together today, I want to walk you through the process of meeting with a client or a stakeholder on your project. And I'll give you some very practical ways that you can use to talk about your designs in a way that'll make sense, something that you can put into practice as soon as you get back to work next week. So the very first thing that you have to do is you have to take a step back in your process. You have to think about the very beginnings of your design. Before you even get to that meeting, you have to be prepared to talk about it. And the way that you design is very important because you need to be able to answer these questions from the beginning. 1, what problem does this solve? 2, how does this affect the user? You can see these questions are lining up nicely with the 3 things I told you needed to have a successful design, right? And that third one, which is going to help you bridge that gap to get the support you need, is the answer to the question, why is this better than the alternative? This should be your approach to everything you design. You should be able to answer these 3 questions. And that will form the foundation of the entire conversation surrounding your design so that you can get the support you need to move on to the next thing. But more than just changing our approach to our work, we also have to take the time to think about the people that are on our project. We have to look around the room in our meetings and understand each individual and what their perspective is, right? We need to work really hard to understand their viewpoint. How does their personality affect their perspective on our project? How does their role in particular affect their perspective on our project? Project managers, probably going to care a little bit more about timelines and budgets, right? Developers, they're thinking about scope creep, reusable code, how to make things easier to implement. Executives and CEOs, they want the big vision. They want all of the big, nice, fun, sparkly things, right? And the more that you can think about the individual perspectives, you can tailor your presentation and the way that you talk about the design to meet their needs as well. But part of this process also includes removing distractions from the conversation. And this is, I think, more important than we realize. You've got to look at your work, rehearse the presentation or the discussion in your mind beforehand, and think, okay, what is going to cause a problem in this conversation? How can I remove as many distractions as possible so we can focus on the task at hand, which is the approval of our work, right? The most common examples that I can think of is the use of placeholder content. Lorem ipsum copy, stock images. I can't tell you how many times a meeting has been derailed by lorem ipsum copy. I once had a stakeholder in a meeting try to read the ipsum copy out loud to everyone else in the room because she had studied Latin in college and she didn't understand what was written in the copy, right? In a meeting with a very large retailer, I did what any good designer would do, and I Googled the interior of retail stores just so I could have a placeholder image in these mock-ups. And of course, I happened to have chosen the interior of the store of their closest competitor. You can imagine how that meeting went, right? And so we have to work very hard to remove these distractions so that we can stay focused. Sometimes people will be so distracted by something that doesn't even matter that they'll be unable to even talk about the effectiveness or the usability of our work, right? And so we need to work very hard. Another one of my clients really loved the left panel that Axure generates in its prototypes. If you're familiar with Axure, then you'll see it outlined in red here. It's just an iframe in the browser that shows all of the pages in your prototype. And this was an older version of Axure. You could not turn off the generation of this panel. It was kind of always there. And every meeting, she would say, oh, I just love how you can see all the things right there, and you can see where this is going, can't you, right? Finally, at one meeting, she said, I know, this should be the navigation for our app, right? Potentially just weeks worth of work just kind of out the window in that one instance. But I decided to just let it go. I didn't say anything. I just kind of ignored her and moved on to the next thing. And after that, I began going deep into the Axure folder and finding the individual HTML file for the one part of the project that I needed her feedback on. And I started sending her those direct links so that iframe would be removed. And you know what? She never brought it up again. So we have to be attuned to what's going to cause a problem because it really can't have real repercussions in our discussions and our conversations about what's going to work and what's not going to work in our designs. So that means we're also anticipating how people are going to react, right? We're looking at our work, we're rehearsing in our heads, we're going to go, okay, I know John is going to ask me why I use this icon instead of the one we talked about last time. I have a justification for it. It wasn't just pretty pictures. There was a reason why I did this, and I've thought through it, and I'm going to be able to explain it. Sometimes just being prepared, just taking even 5 minutes before your daily stand-up to jot down a short list of bullet points is going to go a long way in making you be more articulate in the moment of a meeting. So once you have the opportunity then to kind of see their perspective and think about your work, then you're going to get to actually talk to your stakeholders about your design, right? But you can't just launch into an epic explanation of your work, as tempting as that would be. The first step always when we're discussing design with our partners and our colleagues is to listen. And listening is obviously an important skill for every relationship, but for the purpose of talking about design with non-designers, I have a few tips that I think are really useful. The first one is perhaps the most difficult, and that is you need to let them talk as much as they want without interrupting them. And this can be really difficult, in particular if what they're saying you know to be maybe just misinformed or perhaps even completely untrue. But you want to be sure that they have the confidence that you listen to them and that they were heard. And in fact, I often encourage people to practice what I call the art of the pause. That is, just when you think they're done talking, pause for 2 or 3 seconds, allow there to be silence, just let their words kind of settle on everyone's ears. This can be particularly awkward, especially in remote video conferencing situations when there's naturally delay. People go, Tom, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. I'm just thinking. And so if that silence really is too awkward for you, feel free to just make a transition. Oh, let me think about that for just a minute. And this pause does a few things. Our brains are very, very fast at thinking and processing information, and it's amazing how much time your brain has to catch up with even just 2 seconds. Just give yourself even 2 seconds, and you'll be able to process and form a much, much better, more articulate response. It also gives our stakeholders the opportunity to stop and restart and re-explain what they were going to say in a different way. Often people will say the same thing in a different way in an effort to help us understand. And believe me, if there's a better way for them to say it that will help us understand their perspective, you want to hear it. And then the third thing is that it just simply gives them the confidence that we listened to them, that they were heard. We didn't immediately just jump into this defensive posture. We didn't interrupt them and cut them off. We let them say everything they needed to say. We really listened to them. We gave them that confidence. And that will make it more likely that they will hear what we have to say in return. So as you're listening, though, you have to work really hard to understand what's not being said. Often what people say they want and what they actually need are two completely different things. But sometimes there are just other things going on. How can we read between the lines? What's the elephant in the room? What's not being said? Sometimes there are politics going on. Maybe your manager just came from a meeting where your project is on the chopping block and he's trying to save it, right? Sometimes people, maybe I should say often, people's reaction to your work in a meeting has absolutely nothing to do with you. Right? And I think we have to remember that and think. We may not always know the answer to this question, but we should be attuned enough to the possibility that there might just be something else going on here that we don't understand. Peter Drucker, who's a famous management author and consultant, said the most important thing in communication is to hear what isn't being said. Right? I had another client where we were building this pharmaceutical application where call center workers would enter the physician information and patient information here on the left side of the screen, and they would choose the kind of case they were creating by selecting it from the drop-down menu, and they were taken to a separate page where they could fill out the details of the case because these cases were really complicated and we needed to load a completely different view. But on each of the cases, we had the patient information listed at the top that you had entered on the first step. And when my client saw it, she said, no way, I need to be able to edit the patient information on this second step. And I thought, well, that's really strange. You just entered it on step 1. Now you're going to step 2 and you want to change it again? And her answer was bizarre. She said something about, she was a trainer. She would train people at her company to use this app. And she said, I don't want to tell people that they have to enter it right the first time. Okay, that's kind of strange. And then something about duplicate data. Well, you might want to have 2 records for the same person in the database with different addresses. Okay, well, that's a completely different issue, but it was crazy talk. It didn't make sense to me, but as I listened to her and really kind of tried to pick apart what she was saying, I realized that she saw this as kind of a digital version of the government form that she was accustomed to filling out by hand. Right? And she was distracted by the differences. And so the prospect of not allowing her to edit information anything other than a linear fashion was really disturbing to her. She didn't like the fact that she couldn't go back in a step and change something she'd entered previously. So our solution actually ended up being pretty simple. Using the magic of JavaScript, instead of just taking them to a new page, we loaded that form, and we had to redesign it to make it work, but we loaded the form down below. So rather than removing the user from their context and taking them to what felt like a completely different world, now they stayed in place and they still had access to that very important patient and physician information in the same place where they had entered it. And all of her concerns about duplicate data and training, they all just kind of melted away. But had I just wholesale implemented what she suggested exactly the way that she had done it without really questioning it and trying to read between those lines, then it would have resulted in a poor experience for the user. So that means we're also working really hard then to uncover the real problem that people are trying to solve, right? People are going to give you all kinds of subjective, prescriptive advice about what they think should be done. Move this over here, drop that down here. Our job is to look beyond that, to the problem that they're trying to solve. Don't think about the specific thing they're telling you to do, and instead look further to find the problem that they're trying to solve. And if you're really having a hard time understanding it, it's okay to just ask them, what problem are you trying to solve by suggesting this? I ask this of our clients all the time. What problem are you trying to solve? It's absolutely appropriate to ask that question. So part of this, though, is also converting what I call likes into works. That is, getting our stakeholders to move from talking about what they like and what they don't like, which is just purely their preferences, to phrasing it in a way that describes what works and what doesn't work, which speaks more to the effectiveness or the usability of our designs. It's way too easy for someone to say they just don't like something, right? And we need to remove the word like from our vocabulary. We need to remove some of that subjectivity. And the way you can do this is to repeat it and rephrase it back to them in a way that frames it in terms of what works. Okay, I understand that you prefer we move this control over there, but why doesn't it work to have it over here? Right? And sometimes when you frame it that way, it will cause kind of a light bulb to go off in people's minds. And they might even be like, oh, well, it works just fine over there. I just thought it would look better if we put it over here. It doesn't mean you won't have to change it, but it will at least give you an idea or perspective into their viewpoint into what they think should be done in the application. Right? And then finally, if you're really having a difficult time kind of understanding the request or where their feedback is coming from, you can always ask for examples, reference material, other apps and websites that do something in a similar way. People always have other apps that they're thinking of, maybe even if they don't realize it. And so anytime you can kind of get an example, that'll give you a really good viewpoint. And that doesn't mean you have to do it that way because that's what Facebook does, but it is going to give you insight into how they perceive the specific task or the application or the design at hand. It's going to help you understand their perspective of how they think the functionality serves the audience and the customer base. One of my clients made a very simple request. She just asked me to reorder some inputs on a form. But it struck me as odd because we had already agreed on what we felt like would be the most efficient way for the user to enter the data. So while it was a simple request, it went against some of our previous conversations. So when I asked her to send me an example of another app or website that did it that way, what she sent me was the Excel spreadsheet that she was accustomed to getting as a dump of the data from the system. Now, she didn't want it to look like Excel. She knew that wasn't the right solution. But it turns out she was accustomed to regularly getting this dump of the data from the system, opening it in Excel and using it to generate reports, which she would then use to present to executives. She was concerned that if the inputs weren't in the same order as her columns on the form, that the data would be in a different order on her Excel spreadsheet. It would mess up her report. She had no idea that there were two separate concerns. But again, listening to her and asking for those examples and kind of getting to the bottom of her reasoning allowed me to design what I think was a better solution and form the best possible response. Okay, so this is the most exciting part, right? We've had a chance to listen to feedback and kind of talk about our design, and now we get a chance to actually talk to our client or stakeholders, tell them why we did what we did. But you can't just launch into an epic defense of your work, as fun and enjoyable as that can be. Before you say anything, I want you to do two things that will kind of put you in the right frame of mind that will make it more likely that you'll get what you need, which again is the approval of your work. The first one is to remember this. You've got to give up control. If you're familiar with the 12-step programs that help people overcome addiction and substance abuse, I'd like to propose that the first step is applicable to us in a UX and design environment. No matter what we think about our job titles, or no matter how many years of expertise we have, there's always someone else who has control. Right? There's always someone else who can say yes or no and kind of turn the tide of our design decisions. And the sooner that you kind of just make that simple mental switch, that you kind of let go of that defensiveness, that you kind of let go of your baby and allow it to live in a room collaboratively with other people, the more likely you'll be to respond in the best possible way. The other one is that no matter what you think of their response or their feedback, always lead with a yes. Now this means quite literally that the very first word out of your mouth should be yes, right? No matter what they say, right? And I would say that even if you understand the problem that they're trying to solve, but you disagree with the solution they're suggesting, leading with the yes could just very simply be, yes, I completely agree that we need to solve this problem, right? There are literally a dozen ways that you can lead with the yes without even outright agreeing with the person that you're talking to. Yes, that's a really valid perspective. Thank you for sharing that with us. Right? I know that in America in particular, we learned that please is the magic word. You should always say please to get what you want. But that's not true. Yes is the magic word. Yes is the word that opens people's ears to make it more likely that they will actually hear what you're about to say instead of thinking about how they're going to respond, right? Leading with the yes reminds us that we are all on the same team, headed in the same direction with the same goals. It reinforces the areas in which we do agree before we get to the points in which we don't. And when you lead with a yes, you'll be more likely to have the person listen to you and understand your perspective so that you can move on to that next thing. Okay, so when you're responding, I have a few simple tactics that I think would be that are really useful in UX. The first one is to appeal to a nobler motive. This is one of the steps of communication from Dale Carnegie's 1936 classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Highly recommended if you've never read it. Valid for any area of your life. But I think that this step in particular is important for us in UX because we always have some sort of goal, some sort of metric we're chasing after. We're trying to improve something or reduce something, right? And anytime you can attach your design decisions to that nobler motive, that goal, this is where we're headed. If we do this, it's going to get us one step closer to that goal. You make a really compelling case. The next one is to show a comparison. You need to show your recommendation alongside, perhaps especially on the same screen as an alternative design. It could be the suggestion that they had. It could be an alternate that you tried. The point is you want to have an equal space from which to discuss your work. And I've done this many times, sometimes just split screen in Photoshop. I drag both designs and put a line down the middle and we can discuss them. Often there are very simple structural differences between the two designs that make it quite easy to see the difference. You don't want to be switching tabs. You don't want to be passing around paper. You want to be able to see kind of both of them right there. I did this once, a mobile app that I was designing. One of our design goals for this app was to fit as much content, in this case news headlines, in the vertical browser space. And there was limited space, but we had this two-level nav on the left. You can see the red one at the top, but then there's a smaller gray one which housed all of the filters. And I realized throughout the course of this that we were kind of losing that principle of making sure we do whatever we can to fit more content in the vertical space. And so I redesigned the nav to the one on the right. But my client said, no way. We have to show all the filters all the time. Otherwise, no one is going to know what they can and can't filter on. But I knew that nobler motive. I knew that goal was to fit more content and that was more important to him than exposing all of the filters. And showing it to him just like this made it immediately clear what the right solution was and why. So you're also going to have to be prepared to propose an alternative. This is maybe the main reason that we have a job, right? Is to come up with alternate solutions to difficult problems. Right? This is what we're really, really good at. The challenge, though, can be doing that in the moment of a meeting. You came to a meeting, you had your design, someone proposed something else, it was awful, and now we've got to try to find a way to pull it back and propose something else. Never be afraid to propose an alternate solution, even a bad solution, in the middle of a meeting. Because at the very least, what it's going to do is it's going to create a conversation that demonstrates there's more than one way to solve this problem. Right? So you don't have to, you presented A, someone suggested B, you want to end up at least at a C, because it might even just give you just enough time to back off of it, to go back to your desk, find a better solution, and propose it next time. And so you can also give them a choice then, right? A choice between something that they'll lose and something that they'll gain. And this can be very effective with the thing that they will lose is more important than the thing that they'll gain. Often giving them a choice, this is an important thing for us to remember, that our jobs are to connect the dots for our stakeholders. If we make one change in the system over here, it affects everything else over here. I've likened it to solving a Rubik's Cube before, because people are going to come in, someone's going to come in and say, oh, I want that side to be red. If you just turn this right here, then my side will be red. And our job is to go, yes, I love that. I want that side to be red too. But I have to solve for the whole cube. And when we move one thing over here, it affects everything else over there. And we have to show them how our choices affect the rest of the design in the system. Right? We can't just let a stakeholder come in and rip one thing out of our flow and create a dead end in a different part of the application because we weren't prepared to talk about it. And then finally, always be comfortable postponing the decision. I mean, I'm going to contradict myself, because I would always encourage you to make any decision, even if it's wrong. Do something, even if it's the wrong thing to do, just for the purpose of gaining that momentum and moving forward. But sometimes it absolutely is necessary to just say, okay, hang on, we've got to pause for just a minute while we figure this out. Let's not decide right now. I did this once. I was 15 minutes into an hour-long meeting, and there was just very clearly this downward spiral of like groupthink and mob mentality that was not going to a happy place. And I said, okay, you guys, meeting adjourned, go back to your desks. This is not what I was expecting to happen. I'm going to stay behind in the conference room, and I'm going to try to come up with something different. Please just come back in like 20, 25 minutes, and I'll show you what I've got. But that allowed me the space to kind of curate the suggestions, instead of whatever John just happened to Google on his phone at the conference room table, right? Because that's what happens. Someone goes, hey, why don't we just do this, right? It allowed me to make sure that I was keeping in mind all of the needs and expectations of our users, that I was keeping our goals in mind, so that when everyone came back, I had some informed decisions that we could talk through, instead of whatever the group just happened to throw out there in the moment. All right. So as much as I would like to think that all of my projects are unique and my clients are very, very special to me, the truth is I find myself saying a lot of the same stuff over and over again when I'm working with clients, and I'm sure you've had this experience too. So rather than reinvent the wheel, I thought I would just share with you some of the things that I find myself using over and over again to kind of explain my design decisions to other people. And you may have others too that aren't on this list, and if you do, I would love to hear from you. I always like to kind of add to this. But these are some of the things that I find myself using on a regular basis. One, it facilitates a primary use case. Could be a secondary use case. Could be any use case. But when you can connect your design decision directly to the main use of the application, you make a pretty compelling case to the other person. It could be that it follows a common design pattern. I don't know that our stakeholders are really all that aware of the concept of building a design system and reusing patterns, because we used it over here in this context, and this is a similar one. And it's okay to talk them through why we're using patterns, but that's often a common explanation of mine. Could be that it meets a particular goal, right? What is that nobler motive? How can we remind them of where we're headed? And if we accomplish this, then we will get there. It could be that the data supports it, right? This one can be a little dangerous, honestly. This is like the golden ticket, right? This is like purely the most scientific way that we have of showing that our designs are going to have the intended effect. But in my experience, if you walk in that room and slap some analytics on the table, you can create a situation where there's no decision to make. It's like, oh, nothing to see here, mic drop, I'm done, right? But here's the thing, we still need our stakeholders to be engaged in the decision. We still need them to be engaged in our process. And so while we absolutely need to be doing more of this, and we need to have more data to back up our decisions, I would caution you to be a little bit careful about how you present it. Tell a story, right? Abstract something from the data that's meaningful, and have it available in case you really need it. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend just going in with a pie chart immediately showing that your solution is the only way to go, right? It could be that it complies with a standard. There's almost always some sort of standard that we're thinking of. Accessibility is a big one for me, right? We may not be able to do that fancy JavaScript thing we wanted to do because it's not accessible. We're going to use this kind of thing over here. So you may have some either social or technology standards. Security is another one. You might be limited by technology. You could be limited by time or money as well, but technology is often a big one. Sorry, the API team can't pull that off. There's no chance. There's no chance that we're going to be able to do that right now, and so we have to kind of scale back our expectations for what the design is going to be. It could be that it draws the user's attention, or similarly that it creates a flow for the user. So much time and effort and post-it notes go into getting the user from point A to point B, right? And we did it this way, so they will look from left to right and from top to bottom and click here. And when you can explain your design to people in that way, then it makes sense to people that we want to be sure that they're moving through the application in the intended way. And then this last one is less important, I think, to UX overall, but it could just be that it establishes branding. Sometimes we do what we do just because that's what the people in marketing and the branding police told us we had to do. And a lot of companies don't necessarily have a design system or language that includes interface elements, and so it may actually create a great conversation for you to be able to open up that discussion and start moving in that direction. Okay. So before I end, I want to remind you and go back to the 3 questions that I posed at the beginning, because it's important to remember that all throughout this process, you're going back to your answers to these 3 questions, and you're using those answers to inform how you apply these tactics and advice. Your answers to what problem does this solve, how does it affect the user, and why is it better than the alternative. Now, the last thing I'd like to share with you is a tactic that is shady at best, or downright deceptive at worst, but it can work really, really well. I don't know what it is about design in particular that evokes so much emotion and opinion from people in the course of a meeting. It is true that some people are completely unreasonable. They will want what they want no matter what we say, and much to the detriment of the user experience. It's maybe not quite as common as you think it is based on your experience with your own stakeholders, but it does happen. And so for this kind of situation and that kind of person, I'd like to propose painting a duck. Now, the story comes out of Silicon Valley. The designer of a 3D game was asked by his product owner to make some changes to the animations of this 3D chess game. And he was tired of all the changes. It seemed like no matter what he did, she always had one more change. And so rather than having to sacrifice some part of his work that he really, really loved, he got a little bit more creative. And so when it came time for the next set of revisions, he made all the changes to the animation for the queen that they had agreed upon, but with one addition, he gave the queen a pet duck. And he was sure of the duck to be kind of quacking obnoxiously at her feet, but not so much that she overlapped with the animations that they'd already discussed. And what he found was that the product owner would come in, and she said, "It all looks really, really good. Just one thing, remove the duck." The end. Thank you. Thank you. As Bruno said, I'm the UX director at Batovi. We're a front-end design and development company, and I've been doing this for a really long time, as a freelancer on internal corporate teams and now as a consultant. But I want to be real with you. I want to be straight with you and say that despite all this, that I wrote a book and gave this talk and everything, I've been doing this for so long, I don't always get my way with my designs every single time, okay? I want to be honest with you because in addition to all of this, you also have to be open to the possibility that other people are going to have better ideas than you. Right? There are other ideas that might actually work better. And you've got to remember that your stakeholders have valuable domain knowledge. They have information about the business that you don't have. And we have to be able to work that into our process and make sure that we're considering the needs not only of our users, but also of our stakeholders and our business. But still, I hope that you'll be able to take this stuff and put it to work right away to communicate with stakeholders, keep your sanity, and still deliver the best user experience. Thank you.